Hey everyone, this is our last episode before our New York City sound design meetup on Thursday, October 26th, 7 p.m. at the Crompton Ale House in Chelsea. Come hang out and share some stories and some laughs with the New York sound community. Also, remember you have until November 19th to submit your favorite field recording stories for our upcoming crowdsourced episode. Full details on both the meetup and how to participate in the field recording crowdsource episode can be found at tonebenderspodcast.com. Hello and welcome to Tonebenders, where we talk with the sonic artists behind our favorite films, games, and series. My name is Tim Muirhead and I will be your host today as we talk about the subtle art of cutting BGs and ambiences. This is a craft that is actually often overlooked in the conversation of sound design, and it seems to become the ugly stepchild of cutting sound effects, dialogue, or music. But I think we can all agree that ambiences are what glue a scene together and ground it in a specific place and time. Without strong ambiences, the worlds created in recent shows like The Last of Us, Avatar, or The Grand Budapest Hotel would feel flimsy and simply would not work. So we've gathered some editors together today to preach the gospel of the importance of BGs and hash out the many ways that they tackle making ambiences influence the overall experience when we watch a show. So first up, we have our returning champion, Tim Nielsen. Tim is based out of the Bay Area and is a sound supervisor who really enjoys cutting the ambiences on his own projects. Projects like The Dark Crystal, Age of Resistance, Solo, A Star Wars Story, and Moana. Welcome back to Tonebenders, Tim. It's great to talk to you again.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
So next up, we have Toronto-based sound editor Kayla Stewart, who really opened eyes with her work on the recent Guillermo del Toro film Nightmare Alley, which had a very specific feel to it that was locked down by the ambiences that she cut. She also worked on the Fraggle Rock series reboot, which got heavy rotation in my house. So welcome, Kayla. It's great to meet you.
Great to meet you, too.
Also joining us is Mitchell Lestner, working out of LA. Mitchell was responsible for the ambiences on multiple episodes of The Last of Us series, which I thought had some of the greatest BGs that I've come across in a long time. He also worked on Yellow Jackets and Scavenger's Reign, which none of us here have seen yet, but I think will be out by the time this episode comes out. The trailer looks absolutely amazing. It's nice to meet you, Mitchell. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to meet you too, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Finally, we have Michael O'Connor with us for this talk. Michael has worked on a bunch of great series, including Wu-Tang and American Saga, which is one of my favorite shows. And he also recently released a very cool ambience library that's super unique. It's called Symphonic Ambiences, and it has a module workflow. And I think we'll kind of weave that in because I think it's a good way of getting into ambiences a bit. Michael, it's good to see you.
Hey, it's nice to be here.
Well, let's start the conversation off with just talking about why each of you like cutting ambiences. What about it draws it to you? Tim, why do you get drawn to ambiences?
Some of the early projects that I worked on were sci-fi and or fantasy, and I just really fell in love really quickly with how detailed you could get and how much of the storytelling could be done through the ambiences. And it was also a great chance to get out and record for me, which I love to do as well. So it was a great opportunity to just try and find new things to incorporate. And I think maybe because it is the unsung hero and, you know, it's something that's pawned off. I mean, it was pawned off to me on Lord of the Rings, I'm sure, because I was sort of the new effects editor. And they were like, here, you deal with this. I don't want to deal with it. And, you know, I took that as a challenge and on a movie like that, a huge responsibility. So I've just always found that it's one of the most creative places to play in for me if the film allows it and if the filmmakers allow it. And sometimes they don't. And sometimes you're kind of stuck with something mundane. But with the right project, I just find it's one of the most creative parts of the filmmaking for me personally.
A lot of the same experience, you know, when you're first starting out, people throw BGs your way because everyone thinks like, oh, that's an easy thing. But it's a lot more detailed than I think a lot of people realize. It gives you an opportunity to tell little stories that might be happening sort of around the main action and really set the tone for the scene and even for like the entire project.
Mitchell?
I had a similar experience as Tim and Kayla. I started out cutting BGs as well as a new union editor. But I also agree that BGs can help set the tone of like any scene. It's like a horror, like if you're working on a horror film, like maybe you want to have like very sparse backgrounds to like build the tension. Something like The Last of Us, you're gonna have like a snowy scene. Maybe you're gonna have like wind gusts kind of coming in and out, like ebbs and flows, and just like movements here and there to help set a tone for like abandoned warehouse. I just really like how with BGs can really help support a story, like support the film or TV show that you're working on.
Mike, what about you? What got you into cutting ambiences?
Like all you, I totally agree that it like is wonderful to help support the story, but without repeating the same points. I feel like early on in my career, just working on, indie films, I remember the magic of getting handed over the video, the final cut, and I'm like touching it for the first time for post sound, and there's no ambiences that have been cut in. At least that project I had, the editor may have like some basic bird track or something, but I was a budding artist. I wanted to do it all myself. You turn it from like what sounds like a film set into an actual world when you start to cut in those sounds. That's one of those times in my career where I remember being so excited by like, oh my gosh, this feels like a real film now that I've like put life into this. Whereas like if you take it away, it just sounds like actors talking on a film set. So I think like I've kind of been addicted ever since then. And there's just like endless possibilities with what you can do. So you have to show restraint and you have to figure out the aesthetic of the film. And I think it is like definitely, it's an art to build some like really nice fitting ambiences. And everyone has a different style, which is also really fun.
In my own work, I work mostly in animation. And one of the things I love about ambiences is like you were just saying, Mike, like when we get the picture handed over to us, there's some guide effects, but they don't cut ambience at all in animation, at least in the series level that I'm working at. So like you're really giving it life, but also animation doesn't have the resources in series animation. Never mind, are there birds in the trees? The trees are just kind of puffballs. There are individual leaves in a lot of the trees, So the ambiences suddenly give the lack of leaves on the trees. You can put them there with the sound. You can make the forest come alive with birds and such that were never animated, but suddenly are there because the sound gave it to it. And the sound can add so much to it. Now, obviously, a lot of that is true in the non-animated world, but from my own experience in animation, once you put the BGs in, it's a whole different experience, even when you're still listening to just the dialogue and the crappy temp effects that the editors have put in. It really does bring it to life.
Yeah.
I find that like with the prevalence of VFX now and everything too, and every background is a visual effect now as well. There's no real practical backgrounds anymore. That the sound is that much more important that, the shots don't look real. If they're ever going to look real, they look real when the sound is finally applied. Sometimes they still don't look real, but, sometimes the sound will actually make a scene believable to me.
Yeah.
For sure. So let's talk about the idea of kind of the aesthetics of the ambiences in a project. Mitchell, I mentioned already that you worked on some of the episodes of The Last of Us. Like, that has a specific world to it that the ambience is really locked down. And Kayla, I mentioned Nightmare Alley, a very similar thing where the ambiences made a creepiness to that film that I don't think wouldn't have had the same depth without the ambiences. But how do you lock down on what that is? Maybe, Mitchell, do you want to start with that and how you kind of landed where you did?
Well, I did play the video game, so I was very familiar with like the tone of the show. I would just go through each episode and just figure out, what kind of mood do I want to create for this scene? Say in the beginning, like the first episode, when they start off in Sarah's bedroom, we want it to be very peaceful, very nice. Like it's the show starting off like, everything's okay in the world right now. And then it's a whole build up to the scene where, spoiler alert, if you haven't watched the show yet, Sarah gets shot. And there's all these like, it's almost like a riot happening. There's like off stage gunshots. There's like distant explosions. There's people like screaming in the background. Like we really wanted to like just build the moments in that first episode.
Can you please talk about the cough in the classroom that you came up with? Because I will never live that down.
Oh yeah, so there's a moment in the classroom where I was like, it would be funny if there was like this little offstage cough from like one of the students to kind of signal that something's not right. Like something's going on.
That cough plays so well because funny that you bring it up because that's actually one of the things that when I was discussing the show with friends and everything, even like non-soundy friends, people would actually commented on that scene specifically as really building tension and those little moments in the background. So that's really cool. It worked so well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Was that on the effects editing pass for you or the background editing pass? You know, how these areas are gray, you know?
Oh, yeah. So that was the backgrounds. That was like, tend to think of like the offstage stuff like as backgrounds. So I'll do like a background bed pass and then I'll go forward and do the little nooks and crannies of like the offstage effects. And so the cough was an offstage effect.
It was very effective. In that moment, I was like, those kids are all screwed. They're just all dead.
Yeah.
I was so stoked on that.
Thanks, man. But there was also a point, I think it was episode 5, where Joel and Ellie are going through the stairwell of the skyscraper. And I was like, oh, what could be possibly like eerie, like make an eerie presence for this stairwell that I've never really heard. So I pitched down these pool laps. I had a recording of these pool laps in my my library.
Like someone swimming laps in a pool, you mean?
Yeah, but I pitched them like way down, and then I threw some ultraverb on it and got these cool little eerie kind of like creaks.
Nice. That's awesome.
That's so cool.
I loved in the series too. Like I think it was episode 3. I don't know which of the episodes you did, but the episode with Bill, and you know we'd have just like a total break from the Sonic world of all the other episodes. You know, for that whole episode, really. You know, and like they've created this little utopia, and I think that's episode 3. I could be wrong, but
no, you're right. It was episode 3,
and it was just you know so stark that you know for such a long time it just felt like the world outside didn't exist, and then you know every time you'd cut back to everything else, it was a very wonderfully detailed track.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was actually the first episode I cut on, and then we actually went back and did 101, the first episode. So there was like time cuts throughout the day, and I'd be like, oh, let me get rid of those birds, and maybe I'll add like some other birds in there, and just kind of like, and then add new birds through like the changing of seasons, because I didn't want it all to sound like it's the same birds. Why do we hear the same birds over and over?
Nice.
So, Tim, you, as a sound supervisor, have worked on some really big films. When you're sitting down for spotting sessions, do you go over ambiences with the directors? Does that even come up, or do they, like, how do you tackle it when you're speaking with the creatives?
It doesn't come up a lot, honestly. I mean, they're usually, it's weird. Some directors are really good about spotting emotionally, which is the most important thing. That's all I really care about. You know, some just sort of rattle off, well, we need a door here, and then there's a car here, and you're like, okay, yes, well, we know that. We don't really need to talk about the really obvious things. Some directors get into the emotion of scenes and without necessarily getting into specifics in the backgrounds, but they'll make clear the intention of a scene. This scene is sad. This scene is tense. You know, and that's what I just need to know. You know, if it's not obvious from the story, and if they're trying to subvert what you see or something like that, it's very useful for them to give you some emotional guidelines. But beyond that, very rarely do we get into any details. If anything, they usually want to talk about specific sequences and the effects work in them and things like that. You know, and Solo, the big train sequence or something, and they want to talk about where's music going to be, where's music maybe not going to be, and things like that, which are important too. But yeah, I think a lot of directors, when they get into the final mix, will really start to hear the backgrounds for the first time. And then we usually sort of work on things in the final mix often. Rarely does backgrounds come up in the spotting. Usually it comes up at the end.
So you're just using your own creative brain to come up with it at that point?
Yeah, usually the first pass is mine, you know, and which is fun. You know, I mean, I always think the movie, the project usually tells you what it needs. You know, if you're paying attention to it, you ought to be able to know roughly. You're saying in The Last of Us, the storytelling kind of guides you, and then you help reinforce the storytelling with what you're doing. And the important thing is just to reach out to the director, picture editor when you're unclear on something, like, hey, is this scene supposed to be funny, or is this supposed to be, you know? And if you're in that situation, then somebody hasn't done their job as well as they should, if you have to ask those questions. But it comes up occasionally where there's some ulterior motive going on with the show. Yeah, so the first pass is, for me, just completely freeform. I don't make any notes. I don't think about it. I just start throwing things, and I work very fast on the first pass of the backgrounds because I'm just looking for the essence of things. I'm not worried about the detail at all at the beginning. I just need to find the foundational work to start. And I always start with that. I always start with the airs and the most static things because that gives me the first Lego block. And I force myself to just work really fast. I might cut the entire movie in a day, the backgrounds, the first pass. And then just layer upon layer upon layer, keep refining it. You should work without the dialogue for the first couple of weeks. I don't even want to listen to the dialogue. I don't want to, and then I have to start weaving things around it. But yeah, I like that when it's very instinctual, when I don't overthink it on the first couple of passes.
Kayla, do you want to talk about your marching orders when you started cutting the BGs for Nightmare Alley? I'm assuming it wasn't the director in that case, but tell us about how you got started on that.
It was our lead effects editor, Nathan Robitaille, that was sort of giving me direction, and he had me start on he gave me just like a few scenes to start off with because we were getting things a little bit piecemeal in the beginning. So he had me start on some of the carnival scenes and some of the exterior scenes. So the carnivals are always a really interesting beast to tackle, I find. And strangely enough, I think almost every single show I've worked on in the last several years has had a carnival show up in it somewhere. It's like, it's statistically improbable at this point.
You've been pigeonholed as the carnival ambience editor.
It's true. But carnivals, especially when it's like a big, long scene, it's always trying to move through and make sure it doesn't sound static, because if there's a character and we're following them through as they're walking past different booths and attractions and everything around them, you need everything to sort of change with it, right? So like it was sort of trying to find those moments where I could shift, stop hearing one thing and start hearing another, and telling these little stories that are happening off screen. There's another show that I did a few years ago called Anne with an E, and there was a carnival episode in that, and that one had tons of these really long sort of walk and talks as they're walking through this carnival, and it's set in the late 1800s. So
it's an Anne of Green Gables.
Yes, yeah. It's set in the late 1800s.
Well, not modern telling, but it still takes place back in time, but it's kind of a modern take on it.
Yeah. So being set late 1800s in small town Prince Edward Island, it was trying to find carnival sounds, but there's no electricity, there's no cars, there's no rides, nothing like that. So with that show, I learned a lot to rely more on crowds and shift in crowd energy and activity and what sorts of people we're hearing in different places. And so I tried to match that style on Nightmare Alley and do the same sort of thing where on top of just shifting what games and attractions we're hearing, shifting the crowd. So in one area, maybe there's a crowd watching a show or something like that, and we hear it sort of swell and just that sort of thing. And then as the movie progresses, the main character is sort of going off the deep end a little bit and going down a not so great path. And so at the end, when we get back to carnival stuff again, it's a little darker. I guess when we get back to the carnival at the end, it's not an active carnival. They're in the process of setting it up, but at that point, it's a lot of like dusty, dry wind, and it's kind of it just sounds more, there's not the joy in it that there is towards the beginning when we hear the carnival. So it's just a bunch of men setting up and construction sounds and putting up tents and yelling. There's not the same like excitement and joy that you would normally hear from a carnival. So it sort of just transitions that way.
I was going to say that the crowd energy thing you mentioned is like, that's so hard. Like it's so detail oriented, and to like keep it fluid and not sound like you're just fading between different types. Like that's so tedious. Can I ask what you used for source material for the 1800s project? I haven't seen that, but.
Oh my gosh. I don't even remember it. Just digging through libraries because also trying to keep it M&E safe at the same time.
Yeah.
Like it's just, it's just, I don't remember. It was back in 2018, I guess, when I did that one. Yeah, just digging through a lot of libraries. Thankfully, I have access to the libraries that we have at Sound Dogs, so I could use some of that. And also just a lot of it is thinking outside of the box, and that's when I'm working with newer editors and trying to like teach them how to cut BGs and stuff, always trying to tell them, like, don't just, if you're looking for carnival crowd, don't just search carnival crowd. Try and think outside of the box of, like, where else might I find a crowd sound that I could use instead? So I know I wanted to pepper in like carnival barkers that you can hear sort of yelling things out, but keeping it M&E safe. It can't be an audible language, right? So I ended up finding auctioneers at a fish market, and I think it sounds like it's either Arabic or Turkish, and just sort of cutting chunks of it, just little bits that aren't full words, but can sound, if you blend it in, it just sounds like somebody's yelling something, but you really can't tell what. And then once it's like processed enough and pushed into the background, you just sort of hear this very indistinct auctioneer type yell.
Yeah, right on. Now, the recontextualizing crowds is really a challenge sometimes. It made me think of, I was working on an episode, Tim, you brought it up, the Wu-Tang and American Saga, and the showrunners wanted like this really sketchy sounding club where like people get knifed there, like it's just like super sketch place to be. And so I was like, well, I can't just search like, sketchy nightclub, like that doesn't exist. It's going to be like totally fake. And so I ended up going with boxing crowds. It's like a lot of like aggression and like testosterone, and so just like a lot of like and you're like, okay, yeah, that works, but like you just gotta like think on it, like what other context.
You didn't go to a nightclub and knife some people with a recorder?
I did that, but the voices were distinguishable, so I had to, rethink the strategy. I know, yeah.
Please try not to speak English discernible words while I stab you repeatedly.
Yeah, just print it on my shirt in bold text. I'm an audio recordist. Yeah, and this also might be, going back to the carnival stuff, this might be too in the weeds, but in terms of laying that out for the mixers, when you talk about like keeping the movement, like say the camera is moving through attractions or whatever it was, and I could see you like establishing an area in like stereo or like quad files or whatever, but then you're like, oh, I'm moving through it, and now I have to give the mixer like these like kind of like little food groups to move around. Like, how do you prep that? Do you like turn them to monos so they're easier to pan with, or do you like just keep them in separate food buses in the mix template? Like, I'm just curious about the technical layout there.
Luckily, I was passing my stuff on to another more experienced editor, so I can't say for sure if he changed my organization too much or not.
Sure.
But I typically try and keep it anything that's going to run through the full scene. So airs, wind, stuff that's not going to change as we move. I would keep those on my A set of BGs. And then depending on how wide it gets, sometimes I'll break it up, like B set is just going to be crowds. And so then I try and checkerboard those as I'm transitioning them. And then C would be games and other activities like that. It depends on the show. Like that's how I did it for Nightmare Alley. I'm trying to think back to Anne. I think on Anne, I had games and crowds together on the B set because it wasn't going as wide, because it is like for television. So typically we don't have to go as wide as we might for feature film.
Right. Okay, yeah. I know every like kind of mix team does it differently, so I was just curious because I've had re-recording mixers who are like, I want it all mono. It's gotta like be easier to grab or whatever. But like for ambiences, you're like, oh, but I don't want to give you mono,
Yeah.
So that brings a question. I'm curious. Like Mitchell and Last of Us, how wide were your cut tracks to the back? They must have been quite wide. As wide as the feature, I'm guessing.
Actually, the beds were actually 3 pre-dubs, and then there was 1 pre-dub for offstage effects, and then sometimes we make like a pre-dub for like, oh, there's like snow gusts, and that would just be like 1 pre-dub, and then there'd be like a rain pre-dub. There was that one scene in the Bill and Frank episode where it's raining outside and oh man, I can't remember the Raiders were sorry. The Raiders are coming. You see like they're in the forest. So there has to be, there's a lot of rain and different perspective cuts for that. We go back inside the house and then we go outside the house. So it has a different pre-dub for the rain since it was so big. But actually, the beds, I don't feel like that was that many pre-dubs. How many do you usually work
148.
with? 148.
It depends. I don't know. I mean, Rings probably had 150 background tracks across maybe 8 pre-dubs, something like that. But that's also, it depends if the mixer wants to checkerboard or not. You know, back then we had to checkerboard because we were printing still to mag and different things in it. So we would checkerboard A, B. So usually A1, A2, B1, B2, like that. A lot of nowadays mixing in the box, a lot of mixers don't care about checkerboarding the ambiences anymore. So we get by with maybe six background pre-dubs or 8 total, something like that. But yeah, eight's pretty typical for us on a big feature.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't feel limited. I was just like, oh, just got to make the right decisions and just go from there.
Mike, I want to dig into your recent library that you released, Symphonic Ambiences. Something that's really cool about it, it's a modular workflow. Maybe you can explain it a bit better than I, but quickly, you have scenes. For instance, one of them is an arcade, and you have one stereo pair that is everything in the arcade. Then you also have split outs of the people in the arcade, a couple of the games in the arcade, someone playing whack-a-mole in the arcade. Everything's separated out differently. It kind of leads to the question of how to make the choice between that one perfect sound that's really complex or building up from multiple simpler things. Just as a side note, that library worked out really well. My son had a bunch of friends over and they are asking me what I do. And I use it as a tutorial to explain to them how in-depth sound can be by playing them the full up track and asking them what they were hearing. And then I got to play them the individual elements, and they were like, "Oh yeah, that was there." And it was a kind of an amazing educational thing. And I recommend anyone that's getting into this industry, if you can get a hold of that library to kind of just learn how ambiences work. It's kind of amazing. It's a really fun thing to just
listen
kind of
to Tim. Everyone needs to buy this library. Just kidding.
I said get your hands on it. I didn't say buy it.
Oh, okay. Okay. You know what? I'm done with this call. No, just kidding.
We know how things work in Canada, apparently.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I made this library, the Symphonic Ambiences, like the rest of us, we're all trying to get home at a reasonable hour. We want we want to save time. I work in television mostly. I get, on average, for an hour-long show on my shows, I get around 6 to 7 days per episode. It's a very tight deadline for doing, this is backgrounds and effects and design, if there is any. But so it's like I'm on pretty wicked fast shows, and I love cutting backgrounds. I love backgrounds with a lot of detail, with a lot of options for my mixers. I don't want stuff to be baked in there. And I think it was born out of necessity, because sometimes you'd be like, oh yeah, here's a great arcade ambience. And then if the mixer or director is like, oh, what's that weird sounding game? There shouldn't be an Atari console there. That won't work. And then you have to toss out the whole stereo ambience or whatever it is. And you're like, well, we don't have an arcade anymore. So I was kind of like, okay, it'd be nice to just set up a library where you have all those split out tracks that work on their own, but also they're kind of laid out in a way that you could, if you were under the gun and having to work fast, you can go, okay, let's bring in this, we'll keep the arcade example. Let's bring in this arcade scene, as I'm calling them, to call it something different than an ambience. And you've got like 4 different options for video game sounds. And then, yeah, like Tim mentioned, there's like a whack-a-mole sort of a thing. And then like kids and adults, like as a wall track, as another layer. And that way you can go, oh, like this game's a little too loud. I'll take that game out. Oh, it's actually only adults. It's a wedding party. So you just like kill that ambience and you throw in your own. So I just wanted something that was going to be a little bit more customizable. But also have that like kind of, when we're under pressure to work faster, it's like, how do you deliver like high quality results faster? And I was like, well, this is like hopefully there. But it's also for me, I just like, sometimes you're like, all I need are reverse car beeps for a construction site. That's all I need. Like just those reverse beeps. Where are those reverse beeps? And you like go through your whole library and you get like, beep, beep. And you're like, oh, perfect. And then there's like, arf, 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 like there's a dog barking or something. You're like, all I wanted the beep. So like, that was another reason I made this library, was to like have like these clean and long, like 3-minute, 5-minute files of like just that one thing. Cause as background editors, it drives you nuts if like you have one clean minute of whatever that thing is. And then like a minute in, there's like a dog barking or a plane, a prop airplane just totally intrudes on it. So I was like, this is going to be like my dream of like just like having everything isolated and like nothing, but like at the same time trying to not suck the life out of it. Like that's what's dangerous about having kind of pre-cooked backgrounds is that. So that was the reason why I made it. I don't really want to like be too hard sell about it, but yeah, it was born out of like wanting to save time on my TV shows really. And because I kind of cut backgrounds all the time, I was like, I'm sitting on like 10 years of recordings. I can like pull enough of these ambiences together to make it, somewhat of a useful resource. So yeah.
You've sold me on it.
Oh gosh.
Everything you're describing, I'm just sitting there, like the amount of times I found the perfect background and then there's a plane in it, or there's some guy riding by on a bicycle singing.
Right.
And like,
right.
I'll go into RX and try and clean out, which thanks, I am so grateful for that software. Oh my God. Because I can just save it by cleaning out that one sound, but sometimes it's just beyond.
This is getting in the weeds, but using RX, like I have to say, there's the deconstruct module, which Renee Coronado, that was a shout out to Renee Coronado, but short, Renee Coronado, brought that deconstruct module up on one of the podcasts, and I use it all the time, especially for cleaning up backgrounds, because if you have a great background with dialogue in the background, like some person at a park, and you're like, I don't want that voice, if you highlight that and use the tonal slider and adjust your noise to tonal range, you can like sap people's voices out of recordings and like clean the rest or keep the rest of it intact. It's pretty incredible if the source is not too tonal in its character. So like I use it all the time and it's so useful. Like at the beach, like is a perfect example. If you have like really nice waves or something at a beach and then you got like kids in the background like, yay, mommy, I love you. And just highlight that kid, deconstruct tonality minus infinity, and they're gone. Like it's pure magic.
Zero
Good
kids.
to know.
Yeah, 0 kids at my beaches. Exactly.
We need the D-Kid module.
The D-Kid.
Got D-Bird, now D-Kid.
But it's also a good reminder, like if you record ambiences, don't record 38-second ambiences. Record 7 or 8 minute ambiences.
Yes.
Right? I mean, even go air longer than you think because of those exact things. You're going to find things you want to cut around, and you don't want to find yourself with 12 seconds of the nice air left after you've cut out the planes and the dogs and the kids, And so sometimes it means when I'm recording, it means I'll even return to a location. If I hear some loud, obnoxious person is crackling a paper bag or something, but I'll recognize it's a great location. I'll just, walk around somewhere else for 30 minutes and then walk back past there again and try it another time. Or, scream obscenities at them and chase them out of the park. But I'm in trouble for that too.
Exactly. Pull that knife out that you brought to the club.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like if it's like a diverse kind of like background, like lots of stuff going on, and it's like at all like telling of the location, like if it's like Los Angeles, like middle of Los Angeles, it may seem boring now, but in like 20 to 30 years, that's going to be a golden ambience. Like gas engines are going to go away. Like for just like historical posterity purposes, sometimes I'm like, ooh, I want to keep these 30 minutes because there's enough in there. But if it's like the same kind of thing happening, I'll make it like a 10-minute ambience and call it a day.
Well, there's something that happens in movies and TV shows that is really amazing in that dogs only bark in the distance between lines of dialogue. It's really amazing how these dogs are trained.
Amazing how they know how to do that. They're very smart dogs.
Dogs, the animal departments, they're really well trained, their dogs. I wanted to kind of dig into that idea of filling in the spaces between dialogue with ambience. Everybody calls these types of ambiences something different. Some people call them specific, some people call them spots. Do you want to talk about maybe what you call them and how you go about using them?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, unfortunately, you're sort of tasked with cutting around the dialogue often, although I actually sort of try to work against that a bit, because to me, those things can sound very unnatural very quickly when they're done. They become very mechanical. So I'll intentionally cover a line of dialogue slightly if I can get away with it, or at least get close to an overlap, or try to fight that sort of trope of that. But, it is a way to also keep some life in the backgrounds that otherwise the director might just be like, the dog, it's getting on the dog, just get rid of the dog. And that's worse than cutting it around the dialogue. So you sort of pick your battles. But yeah, there are those tropes and those cliches, of course, that every suburban ambience has a lawnmower or a sprinkler. Every city ambience has a siren. Yeah, of course, we're all guilty. I mean, those things work. Those things are there for a reason, because they work, and to some degree, and because they're expected. Every shot of any rural ambience anywhere in the world has a red-tailed hawk. These are the kind of things that sort of drive you crazy, but it's true. And those are some of the worst examples. But yeah, then again, if you're cutting, something like Dark Crystal or Lord of the Rings, you want all of those little off-screen effects, because otherwise it's very boring sounding. And when they start to compete with the dialogue, you're going to lose. So you have to sort of learn to cut around the action, cut around the dialogue, or at least find sounds that won't compete in the frequency range with the dialogue. Any trick you can do to sort of keep the life in there, right, without drawing attention to yourself. That's what we're always trying to do, is like sneak things in. I think background editors are very sneaky. We have to be, because we can't. If it's drawing attention to it, it's going to get called out, and somebody's going to, some producer's going to be like, I don't like that sound, and you're like, Rrr. So yeah. So I think I have a little collection of sounds in my mind that I know that I've recorded, little details. I know the good dogs that can bark in the distance in between lines if I need them, and things like that. And I'm always carrying a recorder with me, looking for those little tidbits and things like that.
What do you call the tracks that you put those on?
When I lay out my backgrounds, I don't necessarily give it a name. Off-screen effects, I guess we would call them most of the time. But I put them in like the last pre-dub of the backgrounds. So, or specific details or something like that. But usually they're off-screen, right? So they usually go lumped together in one pre-dub. So whether it's an off-screen single bird or a dog or a lawnmower or whatever, that's that gray area between the background tracks and the effects tracks. They go to the background stem, but they're treated more like cut effects.
I agree with Tim, where I try to kind of like weed the offstage effects. Not like, oh, somebody just talked, oh, let's have a dog bark. Maybe I'll have like a telephone ring like right before a line of dialogue, so it's like it feels more natural. But sometimes I'll be like, oh, maybe if I move that like a frame back, it'll feel a little bit better. So sometimes, every single time I get done with an episode, I'll play back that episode and be like, do like little nudges here and there, just like to get a better feel for how everything's playing with each other. But yeah, I usually just call those effects offstage effects or spotted effects, and they're just on their own pre-dub. Sometimes the mixer wants the interiors on one pre-dub and then exteriors on a different pre-dub. It really just depends on the mixer.
Yeah, I find usually I base my organization off of the mixer. If I haven't worked with them before, I'll ask like, hey, how do you want this laid out? And like, I know on one show I worked on, the mixer wanted all door bursts on the D set, which I was like, that makes it easy. D for doors.
Yeah.
I do that as a mixer. I lay out my entire show based on that. Electricity explosions are always on E. Cars are always on C.
That is
body falls are
really
always on
smart.
B. For certain types of movies that that are going to have those recurring things, it's actually quite a useful thing to do sometimes, because I never have to look at at a binky, I just know instinctively what things are going to be. I mean, you can't do that for the entire show, but yeah, actually a lot of mixers I know like to do that as well.
Yeah. Didgeridoos and doors on D.
Exactly.
Let's go back. Yeah, let's go
Didgeridoos.
back to the binky. What was that?
Yeah.
What's a binky?
You don't know what a binky is?
I don't know what a
You
binky
kids.
is.
You kids. Well, a binky takes its name from a baby's blanket. We call those binkies, right? The child
Yeah.
needs their blanket. A binky is basically a top sheet of a layout of the organization of the mix, so that the mixer in the old days, before they could look at a Pro Tools screen, would have literally a printed sheet of paper that was basically the pre-dub layout. So AFX, punches, door slams, whatever, BFX, body falls, and then that would help them guide them, because they didn't have screens for the longest time, right? They couldn't see the Pro Tools, they couldn't see any waveforms, and so they had no indication of what the sound was until they listened to it. And that would just help guide them. You also called it a top sheet, but they were usually made by the assistants, handwritten out before the mix. This was before everybody just looks at a Pro Tools screen now, but we still call them binkies. We even make special Pro Tools versions of that where we print all of the material to mono waveforms, and then we build out a Pro Tools session that just has mono track for AFX, BFX, and very quickly the mixer can see where there was material, and it has a name and a little waveform. So it's kind of like a top sheet in computer form.
That's smart.
Yeah, and it just helps them move fast, because they have all this material. They might have, the show we just finished had 800 tracks of effects. They don't know where everything is. They need some guidance, and otherwise they just turn to me and like, where's that door closed? And then I've got to try to go look for it. And so we try to basically build them some helper information along the way. And we still call them binkies for some reason.
I'm
I'm
adopting that.
familiar with what you're talking about. I've just never heard it called a binky before, but I love that phraseology. It makes sense when you explain it like that. Let's talk about the idea of we're all working on a minimum 5.1 these days, but mostly probably ambience. How do you go about building out surround ambiences when you don't necessarily always have surround recordings?
Yeah, I will say, like, full disclosure, like, I, as a editor mixer, have only worked at 5.1, so I've never personally mixed in like anything larger format than that. I just hand that off to the people who know what they're doing, and they do a great job. So like that's where my experience is. And so like I always ask my re-recording mixers, like, where is your template? And also, like, how would you like this arranged? Because the last thing I want to do is cut a bunch of intricate backgrounds to my philosophy. And they're like, oh no, I want all the doors on the D food group. And I'm like, oh no, I put them on the W food group for wooden doors. And then I have to like go through the whole session and then like rearrange everything. And it's time I'm not going to get paid for probably. So yeah, I always ask them, like, what do they want? And to answer your question, I'm personally, maybe it's just like me working with a lot of like my recordings or stereo recordings, but I usually cut a lot of stereos, and mixers I've worked with are fine with that. They're totally cool, like moving them around. If it's a night scene and there are crickets are motivated, I'll like try to give them two so they could throw some in the back, some in the front that are matchy if I don't have like a nice 5.0 cricket bed or something. But yeah, like I mostly stick to cutting a lot of stereos, to be honest, even on my Atmos shows. But again, I work in television mostly, so like I know we're like gotta keep it moving, so they're not like looking for the utmost detail. Whereas like, if I can, I try to find 5.0 tracks to lay in, because sometimes they add like a nice space to the recording, but it all depends. I've heard like 5.0 recordings that are just so boring to me. and like, if the source material is great as a stereo, I'm like, cool. Like, and I won't just cut that. I will always cut like, I don't know, a minimum 4 tracks, like if not 8. And again, we're talking TV here. But like, yeah, like a good like 5, 6, if it's a dense city scene, like 8 minimum, like give the mixer lots of options, but try to not overcrowd it. But yeah, that's my philosophy. And if the re-recording mixer wants it, I'll cut monos for like helping match the dialogue if they need that for air. But yeah, in terms of like the types of recordings are typically, for me, it's boring. It's just stereos.
There was a period of time where I was really interested in surround recording for film, and I bought a very expensive Ambisonics mic and did a lot of recording. And what I found pretty quickly was that the nuances of surround recordings are lost almost immediately in a film. Once the dialogue is in, once the music is in, those beautiful little details you can hear when you listen to the raw recordings just don't survive. And what you almost always have to do is to create that immersive sound field with monos and stereos and just elements, and you break it apart. You know, the bird that's going to go in the front left, the cricket's going to go in the back right, and these types of things. The only time I ever had really good experience with surround recordings was on Finding Dory. And I spent 3 days at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, had sort of full access to record there. And the aquarium in the movie was sort of modeled after that aquarium. So I was able to record a lot of the exhibits and the cafeterias and print them into 7.1s back then. This was, I wasn't doing Atmos then, but, and a lot of the backgrounds in Dory are actually just these 7.1 beds from this Ambisonics work that I had done. And they just fit perfectly, and there was really nothing else needed. In fact, there's a couple scenes in Dory where the entire ambiences are literally one 7.1 track and nothing else. But that was about the only time I've ever had success doing that. Now I've pretty much sort of abandoned surround recording, to be honest. And I think that it's amazing for certain things, for video games, for encoding ambisonics, for directional things that you need. But I found in the film work that you need more dynamics than the surround. So it's fine to take like a 7.1 bed of air as your jumping off point, but you're always going to have to cut a bunch more details on top of it. And the worst thing is you can't layer 10 7.1 tracks on top of each other, right? You just get noise really quickly. That's the other problem with surround recordings, is you might start with one as the base, but you can't cut a bunch of them together.
Kayla, are you working mostly with stereo tracks?
Yeah, I was going to say that actually makes me feel better, because I'm sitting here like, for years, because I was working in like offices that are shared with other assistant editors or junior editors. And so I was always working on headphones. And now even with my home setup, I just have stereo speakers. I don't have the fancy setups that you guys have, but
oh no, I only had stereo for like the longest time, and I'm like, oh my god, I'm such a plebeian, and I'm finally at LCR right now. And I'm like, it makes such a difference to hear like the center channel. But no, I worked with stereo for like the longest time, and it's still great.
Yes, I think a lot of it is because of that. I'm only listening to it in stereo anyways, so I tend to stick to just stereo tracks and monos for detail, because it's what I've always done.
Yeah, kind of in that same vein, like Mitch, you just mentioned, like the dialogue coming out of the center, which I agree is really nice if you're on a 5.1 project. But I'm curious what you all do when cutting your backgrounds, if you play the dialogue or not, because I certainly do. I always have the dialogue up.
Yep. I play the dialogue. I play the music.
Mm-hmm.
Just to see how everything's playing together.
Yeah.
Even in it's mostly temp music for the most part, but sometimes like in The Last of Us, they use some of that score.
Oh yeah, no, you got to play the music. If there's bum, 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 and you're like cutting these like cute little leaves, like tickling branches, and you're like, these are the best little leaves ever. Like everyone's gonna be stoked on these, and then you're like, wait, there's music here. So yeah, I agree.
But, the danger, though, I will say, I never listen to the dialogue for the first few passes. And then, of course, you have to. And the music as well. But the music is always changing, too, right? That temp music is probably not going to be what the final music. It might give you the rough placement and sometimes the idea of it. But I wouldn't make decisions necessarily based on temp music tracks. And also, for me, I like to cut without those things because I want to know what the possibilities are, so that then I'm going to go fight with the director or fight for things that I believe in. Like, hey, I don't think you should put music here, which I'll fight for every movie that I'm on if I really believe that. And so I want to be able to basically work in pure possibility mode without sort of immediately surrendering to something if I think there's a better option available to us. And I fear that, like, sometimes if I've worked on movies that are 85, 90% scored. And in a lot of those movies, Rings, we fought for several moments in there because we had just worked on our own and we had developed whole scenes without music. And then we presented them and we said, we don't, and we won some of those battles. And music was pulled out at the last minute in a few places in Rings and stuff. And so I think, of course you have to listen to those things, but don't let it demoralize you, because sometimes it can. And, cut the detail leaves anyway, because you never know when the director is going to be at the last minute. I don't really like this music cue. Let's pull that out. And then you're caught with your pants down if you don't have something prepared well. That's one thing. It's a different. I'm curious to hear all your thoughts on this, because there's two big schools of thought with cutting backgrounds. One is it's very important foundational work, and you cut all the detail and you do a really good job. And a lot of supervisors I know would basically say the backgrounds are almost never going to be heard, It's an afterthought. We cut the rest of the movie, and then only we fill in the places where we think they're going to actually do something. And I can't argue in theory that they're wrong. I disagree with it for different reasons, personally, but it's an interesting philosophy, which is basically, why waste 6 weeks of cutting backgrounds when we can cut what's actually going to matter in a week once we actually know what's going to matter?
Yeah, it's a budget decision. If you're on a budget film or a breakneck like turnaround or something,
Right.
yes, you have to start to get economical. But I'm like you, and I'm like ideally, like, these do play, so I always cut like really detailed ambiences. And then if it's like straight up like a needle drop music video moment, I'm gonna like talk to the supervisor and the showrunners and be like, look, are we gonna hear these ambiences? And they're like, absolutely not. I'm gonna be like, okay, and then start to focus on spot effects or hard effects there. Now that the second description you made made me want to throw up, because I know I don't
Same.
I like to I like the world, even if they're going to kill it on the mix stage, like absolutely kill it if it serves the story, but like I want it there, like you said. Like, what if they're like, you know what, this music sucks, or like we don't want music here, what do we got? And if there's just like some stupid boring air you cut, then you're like, I don't know.
There's a lot of times when we're hearing the BGs, the ambiences, but we're not even conscious of it. Like it's almost always not the favored thing we're hearing. But sometimes even when you mentally you can't hear it, there's some kind of emotional value to it being there anyway.
Yeah, I always describe it as like one of those things where you may not notice it when it's in there, but you'll definitely notice it if it's not. Because
for sure,
like when you're walking out in the world, you don't necessarily notice every car going by and the bird in the tree that you just walked past. But if all of those things are taken out and you're walking through a perfectly silent world, you're gonna notice.
Yes, and yes. That's like that's my whole soapbox for like, okay, I just feel like there's been this like trend aesthetically in TV world that like everything must be like very clean, like sterile clean, the backgrounds. And yes, I'm all for understanding dialogue. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying like you are taking away a sonic tool, which is what you just described, which is if you have ambiences and you say want to go into the head of a character, you can now take them away, and that like you could either use it to like make the audience feel uncomfortable, or you can do it to just make it more intimate voiceover, whatever it may be. But if you like have nothing there ever, then you're going to go nowhere. So you're just stripping away a huge dynamic sonic tool. So I'm so with you. And like, especially in like horror or anything that like you have tension.
Oh yeah.
I'm so with you on that.
One piece of advice I was given at an early stage of my career when cutting BGs for any scene, just have one layer, make sure like this one layer has character. Just like if they stripped like the rest, you're like left with just like something that has character in that scene. And I felt like that was the best advice for cutting BGs
cool.
I could have ever gotten.
Yeah, I like that.
Say like, oh, there's like a rattly AC or interesting room tone, not just like stale air.
Yeah. For sure.
One trick that I've learned is that even cutting a room tone for a long scene, I'll probably transition between 3 or 4 during the scene and never just find one and leave it for the length of the scene. Because the brain will always filter out static sounds. That's what it does more than anything else. And so if you want anything to do any work, it's only the movement and the change of sound that actually has any power or effect. So I'll always blend and just long crossfades between very different sounding room tones over the course of a scene, even, or different birds or wind and trees or different things. It's just like the backgrounds always have to be moving for me.
Yep.
And unless you're specifically going to call out a very, very specific moment with the lack of change or something like that, then you have that tool available too. But I just find that the backgrounds have to always evolve, even through a scene, let alone through the movie, and even if I'm coming back to the same location again, I'll never cut the same exact backgrounds. I won't just copy and paste the backgrounds. I mean, I know that probably has to happen in certain TV shows and
the same
things,
5 guys are still at that bar.
Exactly.
Why are they still there?
They keep talking about the same thing over and over again.
Yeah,
and I get that, but
that dude Mike just stabbed someone.
Again. He's not in jail. No, I'm with you on that, Tim. And if because in TV world, like you're saying, we have to like chop, and so there is copy paste work that is done. I will take that ambience and I'll cut it in the middle and move it, move that part to the back so you don't hear the same intro. But if I'm good to myself. It's honestly just like for my own entertainment. I will typically have like, if a show takes place in a dense city, I will have like so many different cities that I cut, and I will get so bored of the same thing quickly, even if that means swapping out just a few of the layers, just to give it that variety. I'm with you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I think this has been a really fun talk. A couple of you mentioned it's something that we could talk about a lot longer, and it's strange that BGs just aren't talked about very often. So I'm really glad that we got to have this conversation, and we'll have to kind of regroup in 2 years or something and continue, because there's still lots more to talk about. So thanks very much for joining us, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah, nice to meet you guys.
Thanks for having me.
Big time thanks to Michael, Kayla, Mitchell, and Tim for taking part in this episode. Listeners should take a moment to head over to Tim Nielsen's new website, soneffects.com. There you can find a fantastic interview that Tim did with Gary Rydstrom, plus lots of amazing sound effects libraries that you can purchase. Don't forget about our sound design meetup in New York City coming up on October 26th at the Crompton Ale House in Chelsea. I'm looking forward to meeting a lot of people from the New York sound community. It's going to be a really fun night. This episode was volunteer edited by Matthew Mutton, who is a pleasure to work with. Matthew is based in the UK, and his sonic adventure is just beginning. He has finished college studying sound for visual media and is now working helping people with their passion projects and indie films. He's currently doing sound mixing, editing, and sound design as a freelancer. He can be found on Twitter at Matt Mutton Sound. My name is Tim Muirhead. Thanks for listening and spreading the word about Tonebenders. Talk to you soon.
Tonebenders is produced by Timothy Muirhead, Renee Coronado, and Teresa Morrow. Theme music is by Mark Strait. Send your emails to info@tonebenderspodcast.com. Follow us on Twitter via @thetonebenders and join Tonebenders Podcast on Facebook. Support this podcast. You can use our links when you shop with Amazon or B&H, or leave us a tip. Just go to tonebenderspodcast.com and click the support button. Thanks for listening.
Are you looking for more audio-related podcasts to listen to? Tonebenders is part of the Audio Podcast Alliance, featuring a hand-picked selection of the very best podcasts about sound. Be sure to hear the latest episodes from our friends in the community at audiopodcast.org.